Hello, all you lovely wonky people. Welcome to the Forest School podcast. It is gloriously sunny at the moment here in the UK. We're having a bit of a heat wave, right? We're at the start of April. And of course, that means all mental health issues have disappeared and everybody is feeling great and lovely. Not really, but the sunshine just makes everybody feel so great. I hope wherever you are getting to enjoy some glorious weather. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast this week. Of course, a huge shout out to everybody that's supporting us on Patreon. We've had a few more people joining us over on there. It really does make a huge difference to keeping the podcast going. So thank you so much to everybody that is supporting us over there. You can head to theforestschoolpodcast.com if you want to find out all the things that we are up to. There's online courses over there, write-in bits so you can get involved in Surprise Student and things like that. But for today, I want to talk about, on a podcast about education and nature and childhood, I'm going to talk about prisons. This episode of the Forest School podcast has been sponsored by Tensile. There aren't many more iconic images of childhood than a treehouse, but the realities of rented sites or running sessions in public spaces means a treehouse is just out of reach for many outdoor leaders. But what if that treehouse could fit in a bag, be set up in minutes, and pack away just as fast? That's exactly what the Tensile Stingray can deliver for your sessions. The Stingray is a treehouse in a bag. It's lightweight, portable, and strong enough to support up to 400 kilos. Whether you're dealing with rocky ground, steep slopes, or boggy areas, the Stingray doesn't need flat terrain. It suspends between 3 trees, giving you a perfectly level platform wherever you go. It's fully weatherproof too. The 70D Rainfly is rated to 5000 HH, so you're covered in rain, snow, or wind. And the built-in insect mesh keeps out bugs, with the covered porch underneath giving you even more storage and shelter. It takes just 5 minutes to set up with 3 ratchet straps and 2 poles. There's no complicated knot work or construction knowledge needed. Plus, the included tree protector straps means there's no impact on the site. When the session's done, it packs down into a single rucksack-sized bag, leaving no trace behind. If you're ready to take your outdoor sessions to the next level, grab a Stingray and give it a try. So why do I want to talk about prisons? I have been thinking quite a lot recently about something that has come up in my kind of browsing around on the internet. And this is the idea of something called the Panopticon, which sounds like the greatest transformer. I am Panopticon. So bear with me, listeners, as we go on a little story about what the Panopticon is and some of the history about the Panopticon. And I promise in a little bit I will bring it round and it will make sense in terms of education and forest school particularly. So bear with me on this story. What is the Panopticon? So in the 1700s, there's a social reformer called Jeremy Bentham, and he has loads of really interesting ideas and champions lots of different things. And in being a social reformer, he has lots of ideas about ways that he could make people better, more moral, more upstanding. And one of the ideas he has is this architectural idea for a panopticon. So I'm going to try and describe it for people listening. So a panopticon is an entirely circular prison with cells all the way around the outside, facing in towards the middle. There's then a large gulf, and standing in the middle, away from the cells, is an observation tower. It's very important that this observation tower has a big gap, and then the cells. So the cells are all facing in. They start obviously narrower towards the inside of the circle, and they get wider towards the edge. This observation tower in the middle either has a single layer or multiple layers which are offset, so that and offset to the floors of the outside circle. And what I mean by that is that if you were to be in the observation tower, your floor, the height that you were at, would mean that you could see 2 floors of the prison cells on the outside. And the idea being that he wanted to maximize how much work a correctional officer could do, how much they could see. So why did he do that? Well, he wanted to make sure. Oh, I tell you what I should say. Other thing that's very important is that the observation tower has either like a mesh or some kind of like fabric that obscures the guards from the prisoners. And the idea for this was that the prisoners in their cells wouldn't necessarily know whether a guard was there or not, whether they were being watched or not. Some more modern interpretations of it have kind of like pillar box, kind of like very narrow horizontal openings so that the guards could see out, but it would be very hard for prisoners to see in through that gap. A bit like an arrow slit in a castle, but horizontal. And the idea with this is that he wanted Panopticon, which is like total observation, total surveillance, because his belief was that if you didn't know whether you were being observed or not, you would assume that you were being observed, and therefore you would behave, in his eyes, more morally. And I'm using air quotes there, more morally. Another part of this is that because of the circular design all the way around the outside, you are also being observed not just by potentially guards, but across the way, other prisoners can all see each other. You can all see into each other's cells. So adding that kind of paranoia and moral observation to the sort of peer-to-peer interaction. And now, one thing that I think is interesting about this is that the cells were designed to, all around the edge, were designed to not have any doors on them. So there's this kind of idea of like freedom in terms of, if you were just to look at it on the face of things, you might be like, well, that's actually quite, open. There's no doors that shut all the cells. You don't have that thing that you do in a lot of prisons where it's like, right, everybody get in the thing, and you hear the big buzzer and all the gates shine across. No, it's all completely open, which means there's not only no privacy at all, but no privacy in terms of like security, safety. People can come and go from your space. It's very interesting as a design. Now, there's the history of it is very interesting. He got some way towards building some of them, but one of the more famous examples was actually in Cuba, and they built one of these ones, and it was designed to hold about 3,000 prisoners in this circular prison structure with, again, a single observation tower in the middle. And they also had, what was really interesting, was a smaller circular building, and I think it was called something like the Hall of 3,000 Silences, because they would put all 3,000 prisoners in this mess hall, but they weren't allowed to speak at all. So 3,000 people eating in complete silence, just as such an interesting kind of weird piece of history. Now, what helped into that one in Cuba was that Fidel Castro was incarcerated there for some time. And when he got out, rather than seeing it and being like, we should take this down, this is absolutely humane, he put all of his political prisoners into that jail, into that prison. Because he saw how effective the paranoia was, because he saw how effective it was at keeping people in line, which is all very interesting. That what happened eventually was that he overstacked the prison. So each cell was originally designed to have 2 prisoners in it, and he upped it to 4 per cell. And at that point, the idea of this total observation, this Panopticon, stopped working. There were riots everywhere. There were plans to kind of blow the whole place up using explosives underneath. There was some sort of critical mass, which is very interesting, at which point the total observation, the paranoia, you are being watched so you'll be moral, just kind of switched. So, lovely story. Kind of weird history story aside about prisons. Why do I think that is interesting in terms of education, in terms of forest school? Well, the Panopticon is often used as a metaphor for surveillance. And I was thinking about what in like modern education are children experiencing something like that in modern education settings. Now, a lot of this is drawing purely from my own experience of round classrooms. This obviously, all of this comes with the caveats of like, these are my experiences. These are just things I've seen. I know there are exceptions that disprove things I'm going to talk about. So this is more of a like exploration than a judgment around the things. But thinking about classroom design that I've seen and conversations I've had about classroom design, and the number of teachers that I've spoken to over the years who, as far as you can get in terms of privacy in a classroom setting, would be a reading corner, a reading nook. And even then, reading nooks are often the corner of the room, sounds very familiar now, the corner of the room facing into the room so that you are kind of privacy from the backsides, but somebody can still see straight in. It's not a central guard tower, sure, but it does mean that someone in a position of responsibility can see in. I've spoken to many people who've set up their classroom in different ways, and I can remember, this is very vivid memory of trying to talk to someone and explaining that I wanted to put, I'm not sure if they are sort of a universal thing, but in the UK, we have these kind of like sets of drawers. They're very thin, flat drawers. The children might have like their own tray in each of these things, or you might put resources in or different things. And you wanted to use those to create some boxing around the classroom to sort of make different areas. And all of the conversations that I had with different people were like, well, if you put a child there and they can access those drawers without you seeing it, they're going to fiddle with all that stuff. You're going to have to face it so that you can see all of that. They will just touch it all. They'll pull it out. It needs to be visible. And so I think there are some feelings around the benefits of the Panopticon, of this prison system, this total observation, this kind of like moral paranoia that are carried over into classrooms, not for any kind of like malicious thing, but that they share some values, they share some thoughts around what is good for people, what is good design. And I was thinking about this example of like and how it changes feeling watched for a large proportion of your childhood and what that might mean. Because I think, again, one of the experiences that you talked to, if you talked about older people in the UK particularly, a lot of their childhood memories happen away from being watched. You know, they are often stories of adventure where they went out into the countryside or they went out to junkyards. I know in previous episodes of this podcast, Wem has talked about going off to junkyards and those being some of her favourite memories of her childhood. And I'm thinking about what's the experience like today, potentially for some children, is that they are watched in this kind of Panopticon total observation classroom all day. Maybe they are then also being watched in a, quite a close way at home. And then maybe if they do go out to groups and things, after school clubs, all of that, there is a high expectation for a lot of those that they are also being watched very closely. And so there are potentially people who are having their childhood observed from when they wake up to when they go to bed. And that's very interesting to think, what does that do to a person in terms of their sense of self, in terms of their behavior? What might be different about people who are going through that as a childhood experience, as opposed to people who are, and I'm going to show some bias here, I think there is benefit. I don't think anybody's going to be surprised to hear this. I think there is benefit to having pockets of privacy and pockets of time to kind of like explore and see what these things are, in the same way that we often talk about like communicative play in the sort of Bob Hughes play type being really important in the kind of preteen years, because it's a way of people communicating and socially testing the water and going, well, what's it like if I'm like this? What's it like if I talk like this? If I say I've done these things or I pretend I haven't done certain things, and almost that like crafting that kind of like, oh, well, I wasn't, nobody knows exactly what's true, so maybe I can explore what are the reactions if I suggest these things. But you can't do that if your experience is Panopticon, is total observation, because you are never in a space where you've got some kind of agency, you've got some kind of autonomy about the story, about who you are. And in that way of, what defines somebody as having good morals to a lot of philosophers has been like what you do when nobody is watching. Now, obviously, Jeremy Bentham's gone the opposite way, in that his idea was like, if you believe you are being watched all the time, you will be good, and then eventually it won't matter if you are being watched or not, because these habits, this kind of paranoia will have sunk so deep that you carry on. And I think sometimes that's the idea, or that's the hope maybe with a lot of heavily observed schooling and education systems, is that like if you get people in a classroom from when they're 4 to when they're 16 being constantly observed, they won't then they will develop those good habits that then when they're not being observed, they will carry them on, which for some people is true. I think by and large, it's people who end up with a lot of anxiety who then carry those things through into their adult life because they have this kind of like, what if I'm being watched? But for a lot of people, they will go through when they get to 16 and they have that first experience or first experiences, in teenagehood of not being observed is when they start to go, right, the only thing that's been stopping me so far has been observation, and there's no observation now. Bam, 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 let's go test, let's go push limits, let's go see what's going to happen. So is there a benefit to giving people these kind of pockets of privacy earlier so that they can start to develop and explore in safe and controlled ways? I'm not talking about complete abandonment and neglect, but I'm talking about building someone up so that they have the skills for privacy and the skills for situations where they're not observed before they get to an age and a stage where they can potentially take on some real risks to themselves and others. So I think that's very interesting. But the caveat to this is to say that, like, it's not always a bad thing to be observed. By no means trying to paint the brush here, that all observation is bad and that we should completely pull back, because there are definitely times where, like, a watchful eye or, a check-in can be incredibly supportive and reassuring. There are many examples I can think of over the decade that I've been doing this, where at a distance, me giving someone, a young person, a little nod or making some eye contact, or actually a really good experience I had once was had a child who signed, and I learnt some basic sign language, and that was great because at a distance, at maybe 20 meters, without interrupting his play, I could make eye contact with them, and I could ask them questions like, "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" And they could just very discreetly sign back, "No, it's all good," which was great. I mean, I'm tempted sometimes to just put signs like that into daily practice, to be like, hey, while you're in the woods, you need to learn this sign language. It's because that is such a useful tool to be able to check in with people and let them know that, like, hey, I'm not too far away. I'm here if you need me. Things are not going to get out of hand, because for some people that is really reassuring. So observation is not just a bad thing, not just something where I'm like, yes, we should completely, get rid of that. So things like that you might not necessarily think are like Panopticon, but they do show up in the classroom, are things like, I've talked about the layout. And then even now, more and more classrooms might be getting like cameras installed, so that even if there's not a physical presence of an adult there who's making eye contact with you and looking at you, more and more schools will be installing cheap security cameras in classrooms for safeguarding reasons, for very valid reasons. But what that means is you've got even more kind of like total observation, total kind of like, policing over the whole system, over the whole time that you are in that space, which most adults would really push back on if they were to be told that there were cameras in their workplace from everywhere, from the moment they arrived to the moment they ended. If your workspace was put under total observation, it would really change how people felt about their workspace. And we'll come on to that later, because I do think that is true for a lot of educationalists, but and people working in schools. But I want to kind of acknowledge that. So things like behavior charts, things like Star of the Week, things like these kind of like, it's like, can you ratchet that up? Because if you think about total observation and that being like, as somebody's watching me all the time, sometimes that just gets put with like glittery lenses on it, because it's like, oh, I'm always looking for Star of the Week. I'm always looking for who's going on the reward chart. I'm always looking. It's still total observation. It's still a scenario where you're, acknowledging to people that you are being observed and watched all of the time. I think that's very interesting to kind of think about what kind of messaging that sends to the young people that we're working with. But to go back to my point that I was hovering around earlier, which is that, like, I have talked to a lot of classroom teachers who also feel like that, who also feel like they are under constant observation, who also feel like, because the way that the senior leadership team could pop in at any moment, or might be doing learning walks and peer in through the glass through their door, that they are also working in a state of panopticon, of total observation. And what does that do to your mental health, in terms of like teachers having autonomy or feeling burnt out, what does that do to you if you as an adult feel like you are being watched and potentially judged all like 9 till 4, 5 days a week? That's really going to weigh on your mental health. And in terms of teachers feeling burnt out, I think that could be, for some people, a very large component, but they've not necessarily acknowledged it, that total observation is something that's really going to weigh in on people. This episode of the Forest School podcast is brought to you by Chris Holland's Nature Connection. Are you looking to deepen your connection to the natural world? We're thrilled to share the Plant of the Week collection by Chris Holland, a long-time friend of the show and someone we've been lucky enough to call a peer and friend for many years now. This beautifully crafted A4 book is packed with 54 plant profiles, seasonal insights, poems and proverbs that bring each plant's story to life. It's a brilliant resource for anyone on their forest school leader training journey, or for sharing with parents and support staff who want to expand their nature knowledge and feel more confident in the great outdoors. What's more, it's perfect for forest school sessions, helping you to explore plants likely growing right near your site or home, all while nurturing curiosity and connection with nature. Each profile even includes QR codes for instant access to even more information, ideal for on-the-go learning. Chris has poured decades of passion and expertise into this collection, and we know it will be a valuable companion in your work or play in nature. And because he's a friend of the show, we've got something very special for you to use. Use the discount code FORESTPOD at checkout and save 15% when you order through the link in our show notes. Don't miss out. Whether you're a seasoned forest school leader or just starting your journey, the Plant of the Week collection is a treasure trove of inspiration and knowledge. So head to the link in the show notes, grab your copy, and remember to use the code FORESTPOD for 15% off. Thanks again to Chris for sponsoring this episode. So, how does this all relate to forest school, right? We've been on a lovely little history journey. We've talked about like how it shows up in classrooms. Do I think forest school changes that? Now, I think it varies forest school to forest school, because I think there's a huge, we talk about this all the time. Forest school is such a broad church. And particularly if we're talking about like architecturally and space design wise, the breadth of what different forest school spaces look like is can be so changeable that in terms of is there total observation or does forest school take away, I don't think I can blanket say forest school gets rid of it. What I do think is that for a lot of forest school sites, something about being out in nature forces spaces to be less easily facilitating of that total observation, because there are trees, there are bushes, there are windy paths, there are like physical things that are out in natural settings create privacy. They're not human designed perfect circle architecture observation tower, right? Even in the small copse, if you've got a tree that is wider than a person, that's all you need for a little bit of privacy, because you can go behind that and you can make faces at your friends or mouth something out and go, are you going to do the thing, right? So just by being in some natural settings, I think you do you have to give up some ideas around observing everybody all the time in the same way that you would in a purpose-made classroom. That said, and this is where I think the breadth comes in, because not all forest school sites have trees wider than, a person, or not all of them will have bushes or corners. A lot of forest school sites that I see on social media are the edge of a playground, or they're maybe a more intentionally designed space by either the school or an outside company. And if I look at those designs, often my first impression of what's missing is privacy, because they take this kind of corner of the classroom and they will put in kind of like posts for hammocks and a setting like a big cover space with a tarp. But if I look around and I think about myself being in that space, I look at it and I think there's nowhere to hide in that. Could you play hide and seek in it? Not really. And so then what effect does that have carrying on? I think there's obviously a balance here that needs to be struck between supervision, safeguarding, responsibility with adults. And again, I'm going to keep sort of tacking my way left and right across this, because again, I'm not saying that you should be like running your sessions in like deep underbrush with like tarp walls everywhere, basically in a labyrinth where nobody can see each other, and that's perfect. We have responsibilities for safeguarding, not just for physical safeguarding, but also for like monitoring and being aware of like, hey, are there any controversial conversations going on? Are some people talking about something? Are people bullying? Is something that you often might not see at a distance through body language and stuff like that. But so it's balancing those responsibilities with the rights and I think the onus that we have to facilitate some moments and some pockets of privacy. And striking that balance will be different depending on each group, depending on the leader, depending on the number of adults compared to the number of children. There's all these things. I'm just here to kind of like explore this idea, and hopefully as I'm chatting this stuff through, some gears will be turning in your own head, thinking about your site. What responsibilities do you have, and how can you be balancing that against these kind of things? In terms of surveillance at Forest School, I think one thing that I'm hyper conscious of and that stayed with me is that in terms of digital surveillance, Forest School has a reputation, I think, of being very Instagrammable, right? It ticks a lot of boxes. You get some pictures of kids like jumping in a big splash coming off the puddle, or people cooking in a mud kitchen, and it all looks like, oh my God, what an idyllic childhood. Yes, I will send my kid here. Here's £100 million an hour. Great. That's facetious, sorry. But what I'm also conscious of, having recently read Sarah Ockwell Smith's book, and if you haven't heard that episode, please go and listen to where we had a chat with Sarah, talking about the digital surveillance and the rights of somebody to not have their moments of exploration photographed, not have them surveyed, not have them observed. And that's obviously a spectrum of where people need that kind of thing. If you want to try something new, and whether that's something new socially, whether that's a physical risk, whether that's a creative risk in terms of making something, then you're going to feel very differently about that if you live in a world in which your photo is taken without you knowing about it. You know, candid photos all over nurseries and early years and primary schools and all these settings, and forest schools in general, candid photos all the time. Do you think you can live an authentic and explorative childhood if you also know that you might be photographed at any moment? I know I personally wouldn't take as many risks, and sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad, depending on like what the risks are, obviously. But I wouldn't be as brave, I don't think, if I thought that potentially some of my mistakes were going to be photographed, or were going to be observed and critiqued, or were going to be, shared with peers or parents or other, because then that's another part of it, isn't it? Is knowing that if you are taking hundreds of candid photos at a forest school session on a Tuesday afternoon in a school, and the understanding is that that's a school camera and it goes back and the head teacher's going to see that. The head teacher is then like vicariously observing potentially all of your exploratory things. You're out in the back of the field doing whatever, but you know that Mrs. Smith is also going to see all of this. And what your relationship is with Mrs. Smith would depend entirely on the kind of child that you are. Some people will be so excited that Mrs. Smith is going to see those things. And some people will go, I don't have a great relationship with Mrs. Smith, and actually this is my space. And now the camera has created this link that I didn't necessarily want to, exist. I am, again, under observation. That's a thing to kind of explore. In general, though, let's talk broadly. Let's say we're in a kind of like bog standard forest school setting. There are bushes, there are trees. There is an understanding of kind of like privacy and corners and spaces that you can go to be more or less observed. But the great thing being that we are not a static observation tower in the middle of a site. We can move around, and therefore even the littlest corners, you can be helicoptering around and seeing all those things. I think there is something about the one of the big benefits of forest school is having that kind of architecture, having natural architecture that affords those kind of explorative moments, those private moments. Often when people talk about the benefits of forest school, they talk about like how much people's confidence has grown, how much their self-confidence has grown. They know who they are. Their relationship with their peers is different. And I'm just raising the question of maybe their relationship with their peers is better when they're not under constant observation, or their relationship with their peers is better when they can have some private moments, more or less, right? If I think of myself as an as an adult, as a human being in the world, there was a group, let's say there's a group of people, do I think I'd have better relationships with them in a total observation scenario, or in a kind of natural space that afforded some one-to-one connections, some space to go off and do different things? I'm absolutely going to feel more connected to those people. In terms of, if you want to talk about community building, community, or maybe this is a big one, community needs a little bit of privacy. It needs a little bit of stuff to go over and to have those moments that are not always picture perfect, or not always like, not the most observable thing that you want to have happen. So I think forest school in general has this kind of idea. If I compare that, again, I'm flip-flopping, right? Because we're going to pin back the other way. Forest school runs on a very high ratio, adult to child, right? And I'm aware that this is a luxury that forest school has. And this is why I think I'm conscious that I will keep advocating for this high adult to child ratio, because it allows you to facilitate this kind of privacy. When you go the other way, in terms of space design, you end up with very big, you want to maximize how many people can one adult look after. Now, the obviously architectural way to do that is big observation tower, prison around the outside. But let's say you can't do that because you're a school. So what do? You have one or two adults stood in a giant rectangle, and you get rid of all the visible, the visual obstacles in that rectangle. So you take a school field and you make sure that there are no hedges anywhere in the school field. It would be super, like, I can remember my school fields where one of my high school had maybe 5 football pitches, right? Now, it wouldn't have taken anything away from the sports facilities to have hedges in between those football pitches. In fact, it would have made this giant rectangular space way more interesting in terms of like division and little spaces and shade, and creating different like microclimates and things like that. But what does that mean? If you have hedges, it means that one person cannot stand in the middle of the field and watch all of those people. So all of the hedges need to be made sure they're gone. What about climbing equipment? Right, we're going to make sure the climbing equipment, doesn't come out, or things like that. So in terms of like architecture on playgrounds and kind of school things, there is that kind of like optimizing for efficiency, which I do understand, right? Budgets are tight. People are trying to work out how do they do this. This is often the time where the teachers get the only time that teachers get a break from in their day is when all the kids are outside. And so it makes sense to try and do that as efficiently as possible. I will draw a comparison though, back to the example I was talking about at the start with this prison in Cuba, which worked fine in with a small number of prisoners, 3,000, right? That's not small, but a small number. And then as more and more prisoners were added, the reporting showed that the moral, paranoia worked less and less and less. Is there a comparison here to be made with schools and with, classroom size, class sizes getting bigger and bigger, with school kind of playgrounds having more and more children in, but not necessarily having any more adults to supervise the thing? Is there a parallel there where, if you're in a small classroom, one adult, maybe 15, 20 kids, you're doing the Panopticon thing, you can probably control that fairly well. One adult, 40 kids? I don't know that you're going to be able to do that as well. If your only goal is compliance and behavior, right? Let's get that caveat out. Physical layouts of forest schools, and I've talked about this a minute ago, in terms of like making them more windy, making them more kind of like having little pockets. Maybe you might have to do a little bit more work as a leader in terms of moving around and identifying like, where can I stand in terms of seeing different things? And so maybe I have to stand here for a little bit and have to stand here for a little bit. And acknowledging, I think as forest school leaders, we give up a lot of control in our architecture. I can remember being a teacher and thinking in my classroom that one of the biggest leverages I had, I was in a mobile classroom, one of those classrooms that was like built in the 60s and 70s. It was only going to be temporary, and I taught in it in like 2015, right? But one of the biggest architectural powers that I had was that if I needed a group to behave, in quotes, I could say, right, well, we're not going out to break then. And I could stand in front of the door, right? And so physically, architecturally, I am controlling that space. When we go out into forest school, we often give up lots of those kind of like unconscious physical architectural biases and kind of advantages, because you're suddenly out in this outdoor space and you realize that like coercive behavior management doesn't work as well when people can just run away from you. You work out that like it has to be about relationships. And I think that's one of the strengths that forest school has, is that it forces people to give up architectural power and focus on relationships instead, and relationship building and authentic relationship building, which is why I think that the people who are involved in forest school practice seem to me to be less and less carrot and stick type people. Again, that's a big sweeping statement, and by and large, all of those things. So in terms of personal take, right, I can remember examples myself. I hope that while you've been listening to me waffle on about Panopticon for half an hour, that you might have had other memories yourself of whether you remember spaces in which you felt very watched, and maybe compare that to spaces in which you felt like you had some elements of privacy. That may be in the home, that may be at outdoor settings, that may be at different groups or other people's houses, depending on your own experiences. You may and just reflecting, what did you gain from those experiences? What did you gain from spaces where you were really observed? Did you feel reassured? Did you feel like things were going to be okay and that you trusted the adults? Or maybe did you sometimes feel like it was overbearing, or like there was a presumption of guilt? I don't know, I'm just throwing things out here. And thinking about spaces where you were out on your own, and did you feel kind of away from people, and what does that feel like? For some people that's going to feel very positive, for some people that's going to feel very scary. Is it okay to live in the scary for a little bit? I'd really love to know in the comments in the YouTube, on Spotify. Let me know, how have you experienced different levels of observation? What do you think is going on in terms of the amount of observation that children are subject to in your kind of daily routine, in your life? I imagine this is going to be something that varies different, school to school, and also geographically. But also this thing is wholly like politically motivated, and kind of like all the ideas of like, well, what's good parenting? All this stuff is so wrapped up in there. So I just wanted to give us half an hour to explore the idea of total observation. What's it going to be like for the young people that you work with? You might decide that you want to go for more observation. You might decide that you want to build in some pockets. I'd be really keen to know where you end up taking this discussion. So thank you very much again to the people that are supporting me on Patreon. When hopefully we'll be back very soon. Head over to the Forest School podcast. You can find out there about our online courses, about our level 3 Forest School leader training that is starting in September. We'd like to give people a nice run up for that one, because we only do one a year. So we try and make sure we're giving people our attention, doing things properly. Total observation, total teaching, no, that's not the way, Lewis. Come on. So people have got some space. People have got stuff to do. Thank you very much, guys. I'll see you next time. Stay wonky. Bye.